The kid behind the counter strummed the guitar, once open strings, no chord, just a flat drag of his thumb across all six and made a face. Yeah, old guitar needs new strings. Action's high, I can do 15 bucks. Emmett Marcus, Washington, stood on the other side of the counter. 80 years old, the tan canvas ball cap from the Paducah River Museum gift shop. His late wife June had bought him in 2011, pulled low over his eyes. The old acoustic guitar lying flat on the glass between them, and watched a 22-year-old white kid in an A1 Palm polo shirt look at the instrument his father had played on the front porch every evening for 40 years and see $15 worth of beat-up wood. That was my daddy's, Emmett said, quiet. The kid Tucker by the crooked name tag shrugged and leaned the guitar against the side of the counter by the neck, letting the body rest on the linoleum floor. The bottom edge touched down with a soft, woody thump that hit Emmett somewhere behind his ribs, like the sound of something sacred touching something it was never meant to touch. Sure, 15 final. Tucker picked up his sausage biscuit from the napkin beside the register and took another bite. Emmett stood there with both hands flat on the glass counter, the mechanic's estimate folded in his coat pocket, $930 typed in bold at the bottom of the page, due in 10 days, or the truck gets towed and auctioned for parts. He looked at the guitar leaning against the wall like a broom. Somebody forgot to put away, and he thought about his father, Grover Washington Sr., sitting on the porch of the house on Jefferson Street in the summers of 1967 and 1974. In 1988, the guitar in his lap, his thumb picking out the bass line to softly and tenderly while the lightning bugs came up over the tobacco field across the road. He thought about the sound that guitar made, the way it filled the whole yard and spilled out into the street, the way the neighbors knew it was 6:30 in the evening, the same way they knew it was noon by the courthouse bell. He thought about June in the hospital bed at Lourdes in 2023, 5 months from diagnosis to the end, the way she'd asked him to play her something, and he'd had to tell her he didn't know how, and she'd said, then hum, Emmett, just hum, and he'd hummed in the garden while she held his hand and the afternoon light came through the window and caught her face the way light catches water. He did not pick up the guitar. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He stood there with his jaw set and his mouth closed tight because the only other thing he could do in that moment was cry in front of a 22-year-old white kid eating a gas station biscuit, and Emmett Marcus Washington had not cried in front of another human being since June's funeral at First Baptist in March of 2023. Here's what that kid in the pawn shop didn't know. Here's what nobody in that shop knew. Not Tucker, not the manager in the back office watching a college basketball game on his phone, not the woman browsing the jewelry case 3 feet away. The beat-up acoustic guitar Emmett Washington had just set down on that counter was worth $287,000. It was a 1939 C.F. Martin and Company D 45 serial number 75269. Between 1933 and 1942, Martin made a total of 91 D45 guitars. 91 in 10 years. Then they stopped. The D45 was the top of Martin's line, the guitar Gene Autry had ordered in 1933. The guitar that defined what an acoustic guitar could sound like, what it could be. In the years since surviving, pre-war D45s had become the single most valuable production acoustic guitars in the history of American instrument making. The last comparable example had sold at a Heritage Auctions instrument sale in Dallas in 2019 for $312,000. Emmett's father, Grover Washington Sr., had bought this guitar used for $35 at Shacklett's Music on Broadway in Paducah in 1953. He had not known what it was. He had known it sounded good. He had played it on the front porch of the house on Jefferson Street every evening from 1953 to 1993, 40 years, 4 seasons a year, the same porch, the same chair, the same guitar. He had played hymns and Hank Williams and a little Merle Travis because Merle Travis was from Muhlenberg County, 60 miles south, and Grover felt a kinship. He had died in 1995, and the guitar had leaned against the wall in Emmett's hall closet for 29 years behind his winter coat. And June's winter coat that he had not moved in a soft black gig bag Grover had sewn himself from canvas in 1954 because the guitar hadn't come with a case when he bought it. This is the story of how Emmett Washington walked into A1 Pawn on a Wednesday morning in January with $930 of trouble in his head and walked out with the discovery that his quiet tobacco farming porch playing father had been holding $250,000 in his lap every evening for 40 years and had never known and never needed to know because the guitar had sounded good and that was enough. Emmett Marcus Washington was born in 1944 in Paducah, Kentucky, in a small frame house on Jefferson Street that his parents rented for $18 a month. His father, Grover Washington Sr., had farmed 22 acres of dark-fired tobacco on a rented plot in McCracken County from 1938 to 1979 and had supplemented the farm income by driving a school bus for the county for 31 years. The bus route ran through the colored section of town in the mornings and the white section in the afternoons, back when the schools were still segregated, and Grover drove it the same careful way every day. Never late, never early, never a harsh word to a child. The children on that bus, black and white, both remembered Grover Washington. They remembered the way he greeted each one by name as they climbed the steps. They remembered the way he kept a box of Kleenex on the dashboard for runny noses and a roll of quarters in his shirt pocket for the kids who forgot their lunch money. They remembered the way he never yelled, never scolded, just drove the same route, the same way every day for 31 years. And when he retired in 1979, the county school board gave him a plaque that said, Grover Washington, senior school bus driver, 1948 to 1979. Safe driver award, 0 accidents. And Grover had hung it in the kitchen next to the door where it stayed until the day he died. His mother, Opal, had cooked at the Paducah Tilghman High School cafeteria for 26 years, standing over industrial stoves in a kitchen that got to 95 degrees in the summers, serving meatloaf and mashed potatoes and green beans to students who didn't know her name. She came home every evening smelling like fryer oil and dish soap, and she never complained, not once. She had grown up in Ballard County, the daughter of sharecroppers, and she had worked in tobacco fields from the time she was 8 years old until she married Grover in 1943 at the age of 22. The cafeteria job was inside work, steady work that paid every 2 weeks like clockwork, and Opal had considered herself blessed to have it. She sang in the choir at First Baptist for 38 years, all to the second row from the back on the left side. She made quilts in the winter, piecing together scraps of fabric from old dresses and worn-out shirts, and she gave them away to anyone who needed one. When the Johnson family's house burned down in 1971, Opal showed up the next day with 3 quilts and a pot of vegetable soup. When the Reverend's wife had twins in 1976, Opal brought 2 quilts, 1 pink, 1 blue, in a casserole that would feed the family for 3 days. She died in 1992 of a stroke sudden in the kitchen with a dish towel in her hand, and at her funeral, the church was so full people stood in the aisles and out on the steps, and the choir sang all 4 verses of Blessed Assurance because it had been her favorite. Emmett went to Lone Oak High, graduated in 1962, did 4 years in the Army, 2 at Fort Campbell, 2 in Germany, came home, and spent 36 years at the Paducah Gaseous Diffusion Plant as a pipe fitter. It was good work, union work, the kind of work that built a pension and paid for a house. The plant, a sprawling complex of buildings and cooling towers on the western edge of Paducah, had employed thousands of men over the decades, and Emmett had been one of them, clocking in at 7 in the morning and clocking out at 3:30 in the afternoon 5 days a week for 36 years. The work was hard. Pipe fitting meant crawling into tight spaces, welding pipes in positions that hurt your back, and your knees breathing air that tasted like metal, and chemicals coming home every evening with your clothes stiff with sweat and your hands black with grease. But it was steady. It was union. It came with health insurance and a pension, and in 1968, when Emmett married June Bolin, he had known he could support a family on a pipe fitter's wage, and that had been enough. He married June Bolin in 1968 at First Baptist Church on Jefferson Street, the same church where his parents had married in 1943. June had grown up 3 streets over on Madison, the daughter of a truck driver and a seamstress, and she had known Emmett since they were both 14 years old. They had dated for 4 years before Emmett asked her to marry him, and when he did, standing on her parents' front porch on a Saturday evening in May, with a small diamond ring he'd saved 6 months to buy, she had said yes before he'd finished the question. They had one son, Grover Jr., named for Emmett's father, born in 1969, at Lourdes Hospital on a Tuesday morning in March, 8 pounds, 4 ounces, with a full head of black hair and his grandfather's long fingers. Grover Sr. had cried when he held his grandson for the first time standing in the hospital room with the baby in his arms, and he had said to Emmett, "You did good, son. You did real good." And then he had sung to the baby very quietly the first verse of Amazing Grace, and June had cried. And Emmett had stood there watching his father hold his son and thinking that this was what life was supposed to be. Grover Jr. grew up in the house on Jefferson Street, in the small bedroom at the back of the house that had been Emmett's bedroom when he was a boy. He went to Lone Oak Elementary and then Lone Oak High, played football for 2 years until he broke his collarbone, ran track, made decent grades, graduated in 1987, and went to work for UPS the following Monday. He had wanted to go to college, had talked about studying engineering, but there wasn't money for it, and Grover Jr. had not complained. He had gone to work, and he had been good at it, and by the time he was 30, he was a warehouse supervisor, and by the time he was 40, he was a warehouse manager, and he had married a woman named Alicia Moore in 1995, and had 2 children, Marcus in 2004 and Tasha in 2006. June had died in 2023 of ovarian cancer, 5 months from diagnosis to the end, and the house on Jefferson Street had felt like a museum ever since, full of things that used to mean something when there was someone to share them with. Her coffee mug was still in the cabinet, the blue one with the white flowers she'd used every morning for 30 years. Her reading glasses were still on the table beside the couch where she'd left them the last time she'd sat there. Her coat was still hanging on the hook by the door. Emmett had not moved any of it. He could not. Moving it felt like erasing her, and he was not ready to erase her, would never be ready. The truck was the problem. The 2000 Ford Ranger Green, 140,000 miles, the truck June had told him to buy in 2000 because the old Chevy was going to leave him on the side of US 61 of these days, had thrown the timing chain in December. Emmett had been driving to the VA clinic in Marion for a cardiology appointment when the engine made a sound like a tin can full of rocks and then stopped making any sound at all. He'd coasted into the Sutherland's auto service parking lot on Broadway, and the mechanic, a younger white guy named Dale with oil under his fingernails, had walked out, popped the hood, looked inside, and shaken his head. "Timing chain, Mr. Washington. Tensioner shot too. Got to pull the whole front of the engine to get at it." Dale had written the estimate on a yellow carbon copy form, his handwriting slanted and hurried. "Parts labor shop fees, $930. Emmett had folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and asked how long he had. Dale had said 2 weeks, maybe 3 if you don't drive it. "After that, I got to clear the lot. If it's still here, I'll have to tow it to auction." Without the truck, Emmett couldn't get to the VA clinic in Marion, 30 miles west, where he went every 3 months for his heart, the cardiomyopathy they'd found in 2019 that required monitoring. He couldn't get to the Kroger on Lone Oak Road, where he bought his groceries every Thursday. He couldn't get to First Baptist Church on Jefferson Street, where he'd been a deacon for 34 years, where he still sat in the same pew, 4th row on the right, where June used to sit beside him with her hymnal open to the same page, even though she knew all the words. His plant pension was $1,620 a month. Social Security had added $2,140. After property taxes on the small frame house on Jefferson Street, $1,400 a year, and homeowners insurance, $920 a year, and electric and gas that ran $180 in the winter and $95 in the summer, and his heart medications, 2 prescriptions at $60 each per month, and his diabetes medication, 1 prescription at $45 a month, In groceries, about $280 a month for a man eating alone. He had about $120 of slack in a good month. Some months it was 80, some months it was 200 if nothing broke. He did not have $930. He could have called Grover Jr. in Louisville. Grover Jr. was a good son, steady, responsible, the kind of man who called every Sunday evening to check in. He had a decent job with UPS warehouse manager, good benefits, but not great money. Not the kind of money that left much room after the mortgage and the car payments and the health insurance premiums. He had two kids, Marcus 20 at Murray State studying business and Tasha 18 starting community college in the fall. Emmett had not asked his son for $1 in 20 years. He was not going to start over a timing chain. For 14 days he walked. The mile to the Kroger, the mile back carrying 2 plastic bags of groceries in each hand, stopping twice to rest on the bench outside the post office. He caught rides to church with his neighbor, Kenny Phelps, a retired railroad man who drove a Buick that smelled like cigar smoke and air freshener. He missed one V, an appointment called and rescheduled for February. On the 15th morning, Wednesday, January 15th, 2024, he went to the hall closet. The guitar leaned against the back wall of the closet behind his winter coat. The heavy brown Carhartt he'd worn to the plant for 30 years, and June's winter coat, the wool one with the fake fur collar she'd bought at JCPenney in 1998, that he had not moved, could not move, because moving it felt like erasing her. The guitar was in the soft black gig bag Grover had sewn himself from canvas in 1954, the zipper broken halfway up the strap, frayed at one end. Emmett unzipped what would unzip and slid the guitar out. It was a dreadnought, the big flat-top body shape that Martin had more or less invented in the 1930s. The top was Adirondack spruce, aged to a deep honey amber darker, where the sunlight had hit it through the screen door on the porch for 40 years. The back and sides were Brazilian rosewood so dark it was nearly black at the waist with faint vertical stripes running through the grain like watermarks on old wood. The neck was mahogany smooth, under the hand the fingerboard ebony worn flat where Grover's fingers had pressed the strings for 40 years in the same places over and over. The tuning machines were open-geared Grover Rotomatics that Grover Sr. had installed himself in 1967 to replace the originals that had stripped. Emmett remembered that age 23, sitting at the kitchen table doing his Army discharge paperwork, while his father sat across from him with a tiny screwdriver and the tuning machines laid out on a towel, working slow and careful the same way he did everything. Grover had ordered the tuning machines from a catalog, had waited 3 weeks for them to arrive. And when they came, he had spent an entire Saturday afternoon installing them, measuring twice, drilling once, making sure everything was straight and tight and right. The binding was white ivory with, and this was the detail that would later make Dr. Jack Renfro's heart rate change abalone, pearl inlay along the top edge. The headstock bore the C.F. Martin and Company stamp in gold, faded, but still legible. The pickguard was tortoiseshell celluloid, cracked at one corner. The finish had checking a web of fine hairline cracks across the entire surface of the tone and the back, and the sides the kind of checking that came from 70 years of temperature changes, summer heat and winter cold humidity, rising and falling, the wood expanding and contracting, slow as a heartbeat for decades. There were pick scratches below the sound hole, hundreds of them layered over each other, like a record of every song Grover had ever played. There was a small dent on the lower bow, the curve of the body below the waist, where Grover's belt buckle had worn a shallow depression into the spruce over 40 years of playing. Emmett ran his thumb over the dent. He could see his father sitting in the chair on the porch, the guitar resting against his stomach, the belt buckle pressing into the wood night after night, year after year. The dent was shaped like an oval worn smooth, the wood compressed but not broken, and it told the story of 40 years as clearly as any words could. The guitar had not been played in 29 years. The strings were dead oxidized to a dull bronze green. The action, the height of the strings above the fretboard, had risen as the neck had slowly bowed forward under decades of string tension without the counterbalance of being played. but the body was solid, the bracing inside the wooden struts glued to the underside of the top that gave the guitar its structure, and its sound was intact. Emmett could feel it when he held the guitar, the weight of it, the solidity. The sound, if you put new strings on it and tuned it, would still be the sound Grover Washington had listened to on the porch every evening for 40 years. A sound that people who know acoustic guitars describe without irony as the voice of God clearing his throat. Emmett had not played guitar. He had never learned. He had listened to his father play from the kitchen table doing homework through the screen door for the entire duration of his childhood, from age 6 to age 18, and he had loved the sound without ever wanting to make it himself. Some men want to be the music. Some men want to hear it. Emmett had been the second kind. Grover had told him about the guitar exactly once in 1972, sitting on the porch in the late afternoon with a glass of iced tea sweating on the railing between them. Emmett, home on leave from Fort Campbell, 28 years old, not yet married. I bought that guitar at Shacklets in 53, Grover had said. $35. Old man Shacklets said it had been in the shop for 2 years and nobody wanted it because it was too big and too loud. I picked it up and played a G chord and I said, Mr. Shacklet, this guitar sounds like a church. And he said, son, for $35, it's yours. Grover had taken a sip of his tea and looked out at the tobacco field across the road. I've played it every night since he said, every night I've been home. Grover Washington Sr. had not been a performer. He had not been a musician in any formal sense. He had never played in a band. He had never played at church, though the preacher Reverend Calvin Morris had asked him twice, once in 1965 and once in 1981. Grover had declined both times, polite but firm. Playing on the porch was private. Playing at church would have been public. The guitar was not for showing, it was for hearing. He had played on his porch for himself and for the tobacco field across the road and for Opal when she was alive, sitting in the chair beside him, shelling peas or mending shirts, and for the evening and for the sound. He had known maybe 30 songs. He had played them in the same order most nights, starting with I Saw the Light and ending with Softly and Tenderly. And he had played them the same way every time, with the same finger-picking pattern he had taught himself from a Mel Bay instruction book in 1954, the thumb hitting the bass strings on the beat, the fingers pulling the melody strings on the offbeat, steady as a metronome, steady as his heartbeat. The Mel Bay book, yellowed and dog-eared with pencil marks in the margins, where Grover had written notes to himself, was still in the house somewhere, probably in a box in the attic. And Emmett thought about looking for it and then decided he wouldn't know what to do with it if he found it. He had never changed a string in his life until Opal had bought him a set of Martin Marquis mediums at Shacklets for Christmas in 1971. Emmett remembered that Christmas morning. He had been 27, married to June for 3 years, and they had driven over to the house on Jefferson Street for breakfast. Grover had opened the package from Opal, looked at the strings, and his eyes had filled with tears. He had hugged her long and tight and said, "Thank you, Opal. Thank you." And Opal had said, "I know you love that guitar, Grover. It deserves new strings." After that, Grover had changed strings once a year on Christmas morning, before breakfast, sitting at the kitchen table with the old strings coiled in the trash and the new strings laid out in order on a towel, working slow tuning each string 3 times before he moved to the next one. It was a ritual, the way some men shave the same way every morning or fold their newspaper the same way. Emmett had watched his father do it every Christmas from 1972 until 1994, the last Christmas before Grover died, and it had never varied, not once. The same towel, the same chair, the same careful hands. The guitar had been Grover's companion, the way some men have dogs or pipes or rocking chairs. It had been the thing he reached for at the end of every working day after he parked the school bus in the county lot and drove home in the truck after he washed his hands and hung his coat on the hook by the door. It had been the thing that told him the day was over and the evening had begun. Without the guitar, Grover would have been the same man, quiet, reliable, precise about his tobacco rows, A man who kept his word and paid his debts and never raised his voice. With the guitar, he had been that man, plus a sound that carried across the yard and into the road and down the block. A sound that made people stop what they were doing for a moment and listen, not because it was fancy or complicated, but because it was true. Emmett sat at the kitchen table that Wednesday morning, January 15th, 2024, with the guitar in front of him and the mechanic's estimate 3 inches from his coffee mug, and he did something he had sworn he would never do. He put the guitar back in the canvas gig bag, zipped it as far as the broken zipper would go, and carried it out to Kenny Phelps' truck. Kenny had lent him the truck for the day, said, "Take it, Emmett. I'm not going anywhere. Bring it back when you're done." Emmett drove into town. A one-pawn sat on South 3rd Street between a Dollar General and a Rent-A-Center, a narrow storefront with barred windows and a neon sign that said, "We buy gold" in yellow letters. The bell over the door jangled as Emmett stepped inside carrying the gig bag by the broken strap. The shop smelled like cigarette smoke and pine cleaner. There were guitars on the wall behind the counter, maybe 20 of them, all Electrics Fenders and Gibsons and off-brand Strats and a rack of rifles locked behind a steel mesh cage and glass cases full of jewelry and watches and knives. Tucker was behind the counter eating a gas station sausage biscuit, the kind that comes in the plastic wrapper, and scrolling through his phone with his free hand. He looked up after about 10 seconds. "Help you?" "I've got an old guitar," Emmett said. "My daddy's. Was wondering what you might give for it." "Let's see it." Emmett set the gig bag on the counter and unzipped it and lifted the guitar out. He laid it flat on the glass face up the way you lay a sleeping child in a crib. Tucker set his phone down and wiped his hands on a napkin. He picked the guitar up by the neck with one hand, the body swinging free. He turned it over. He looked at the back. He looked at the front. He held it up to the fluorescent lights and squinted at the headstock. He strummed the dead strings once with his thumb, a flat, tuneless sound. "Yeah, old acoustic Martin looks like." He turned the guitar sideways and looked at the label inside through the sound hole, tilting it toward the light. "Old Martins are hit or miss. This one's beat. Checking on the finish crack and the pickguard strings are dead actions way high." He set the guitar down on the counter, not flat, but leaning against the side of the counter by the neck, the body resting on the linoleum floor. The bottom edge of the guitar touched the floor with a soft, woody thump. 15, maybe $20. "It's a Martin D something," Emmett said. "My daddy bought it in 1953. He played it every day for 40 years. "Sure, Pops," Tucker said. He picked up his biscuit and took a bite. "I can't sell beat-up acoustics, man. Kids want electrics. Old guys want new Taylors." He waved his hand at the Gayar the way a man waves at a housefly garage sale. Emmett's jaw set. He put both hands flat on the counter. The glass was cool under his palms. He thought about the timing chain, the yellow estimate folded in his coat pocket, $930 due in 10 days. He thought about June in the oncology ward at Lourdes, the way the light had come through the window at 5 in the afternoon and caught her face, the way her skin had looked like paper thin and translucent, the way she had said, "Play me something." Emmett, and he had had to tell her he didn't know how, and she had said, "Then hum," and he had hummed in the garden while she held his hand and the machines beeped and the IV dripped and the afternoon turned to evening. He thought about sitting beside her bed for 5 months watching her fade, watching the cancer take her piece by piece first, her appetite, then her strength, then her vice until at the end, she was just a whisper in a hand in his, and then she was gone. He thought about the funeral, the church packed the choir, singing Amazing Grace, the coffin at the front draped with white flowers, and the ride to the cemetery, and the moment when they lowered her into the ground, and he had stood there thinking, "This is it. This is the rest of my life without her." He thought about his father on the porch, the G chord, the screen door, the iced tea, the lightning bugs. He thought about the way Grover had held the guitar, both hands cradling it like something alive, the way he had tuned it before he played every night, plucking each string and turning the tuning pegs with his thumb, listening, adjusting, listening again, patient, until it was right. He thought about the thousands of evenings, the thousands of songs, the sound that had filled the house and the yard and the street for 40 years. He did not pick up the guitar. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He stood there with both hands flat on the glass and his mouth closed tight, because the only other thing he could do was cry in front of a 22-year-old, and Emmett Washington had not cried in front of another human being since June's funeral. The bell over the door jangled again. A man came in early 60s, lean about 6 feet with shoulder-length silver gray hair, pulled back in a ponytail, a neatly trimmed salt and pepper goatee, and small oval wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a black leather jacket over a blue chambray shirt, dark jeans, and brown cowboy boots that had been resoled at least once, the stitching visible along the edge of the sole. He carried a battered brown leather gig bag, backpack style, over one shoulder. There was a small gold pin on his jacket lapel, the logo of the American Guitar Foundation, though Emmett, if he had looked closely, would not have known what it was. The man came 2 steps inside the shop and stopped. He glanced at the counter. He glanced at Emmett. He glanced at Tucker. And then he saw the guitar leaning against the side of the counter, the body resting on the linoleum floor. He stopped walking. He stood perfectly still for what felt like a long time, but was probably 4 seconds. His eyes moved from the headstock to the body to the back, and then back to the headstock. Then he looked at the top edge of the guitar, at the binding, and his face changed. Not a big change, a small one. The kind of change a man makes when he sees something he wasn't expecting to see and has to work very hard not to react. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was quiet and very calm, the calm of a man who is working very hard not to say what he wants to say at the volume he wants to say it. "Sir, is that guitar for sale?" Tucker looked up from his biscuit. "Old guy's selling, $15. The man did not look at Tucker. He looked at Emmett. "Sir, my name is Jack Renfro. I am the founder and senior appraiser of Renfro Vintage Instruments in Nashville, Tennessee, and I sit on the authentication panel for Heritage Auctions, Musical Instruments Division. I am in Paducah this week because I'm buying a banjo collection from an estate in Lone Oak. I came in here because," he paused, "because I always stop at pawn shops. Would you permit me to examine that guitar?" Emmett found his voice. It came out quieter than he meant it to. "You're asking me, it's yours, isn't it? It was my daddy's." "Then yes, sir, I'm asking you. And I would ask you, please, to not let the body of that guitar touch this linoleum floor for one more second." Tucker straightened up. He reached down and lifted the guitar off the floor by the neck, the body swinging. Jack Renfro was already moving. He set his gig bag backpack on the counter and unzipped it. He drew out a pair of folded white cotton archival gloves, the kind museum workers use. He drew out a 10 times jeweler's loop on a cord. He drew out a small LED maglite pen light. He drew out a soft chamois cloth. He drew out a small precision hygrometer in a leather case. He drew out a leather-bound notebook and a pen. He pulled the gloves on, finger by finger, the white cotton tight across his knuckles. "May I?" Emmett nodded. Jack Renfro took the guitar from Tucker's hand the way a man takes a sleeping child from someone who doesn't know how to hold one. Both hands. One cradling the neck at the nut, the place where the headstock meets the fingerboard. One supporting the body at the lower bout, the curve below the waist. He laid the guitar face up on the chamois on the counter. He tilted the guitar under the fluorescent lights. He studied the top, the deep honey amber Adirondack spruce, the checking, the fine spider web of cracks, the pick wear below the sound hole, the belt buckle dent on the lower bout. He ran a gloved fingertip along the abalone pearl binding at the top edge, slow feeling the texture, the way the pearl caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the glass counter. He turned the guitar over both hands, careful. He studied the Brazilian rosewood back. He studied the center seam, the line where the two book-matched pieces of rosewood met in the middle. He studied the heel of the neck, where the neck joined the body. He turned the guitar back over. He shone the LED flashlight through the sound hole into the body cavity. The light illuminated the bracing, inside the wooden struts, the label glued to the inside of the back. He brought the loop to his eye. He leaned close. He read the label. C.F. Martin and Company, Nazareth, Pennsylvania. Below the logo in the serial number, field 5 digits. 75269. He went still. He read it again. He shone the light at a different angle. He read it a third time. He set the flashlight on the counter. He took the loop away from his eye. He took off his oval wire-rimmed glasses. He closed his eyes. He opened them. He put the glasses back on. He looked at Emmett. His voice had changed, not louder, quieter. Mr. Tall Washington, Emmett Washington, Mr. Washington. The label inside this guitar reads C.F. Martin and Company, Nazareth, Pennsylvania. Below the logo in the serial number field is the number 75269. He paused. Mr. Washington, do you know what a D45 is? No, sir. My daddy called it his Martin. That's all. Jack Renfro nodded slowly. He set the guitar down on the chamois. He folded his hands on the counter. Mr. Washington, in 1933, a singing cowboy named Gene Autry, walked into the C.F. Martin factory in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, and asked them to build him the finest flat-top guitar they had ever made. Martin built him the D45, a dreadnought body with Adirondack spruce top, Brazilian rosewood back, and sides abalone pearl inlay on the binding, the headstock, and the fingerboard markers. It was the most ornate and the finest sounding production acoustic guitar in the world. Martin made the D45 from 1933 to 1942, when they stopped production because of the war, because they couldn't get the materials anymore, the Brazilian rosewood, the abalone. In those 10 years, they made a total of 91 guitars, 91 Mr. Washington, in 10 years. Then they stopped. The fluorescent tube over the door flickered. Tucker had stopped chewing. His biscuit sat on the napkin beside the register untouched, getting cold. Serial number 75269 corresponds to production. Year 1939. This guitar is number 73 of the 91 pre-war D45s ever produced. Of those 91, approximately 68 are known to survive in private and institutional collections. Some were lost in fires. Some were lost in floods. Some were lost to time, sitting in attics and basements and storage units, their owners not knowing what they had. This is one of them. Jack Renfro picked the guitar up again. He held it in the fluorescent light. He turned it slowly. The abalone binding caught the light and threw small rainbows across the glass counter, across the wall, across Tucker's face. Mr. Washington, pre-war Martin D45s are, without exaggeration, the most valuable production acoustic guitars in the history of American instrument making. They are the standard against which every acoustic guitar ever made is measured. The last comparable example, a 1940 D45 in similar playing condition with similar checking and wear, sold at Heritage Auctions in Dallas in 2019 for $312,000. This guitar has been played hard, played every day by a man who loved it. The finish is checked. The pickguard is cracked. There's a belt buckle dent on the lower bout that tells me whoever played this guitar played it sitting with it in his lap every day for decades. The tuning machines have been replaced. Those are aftermarket Grovers, not the original open backs, which affects the value slightly, maybe 10%. But the body is original. The top, the back, the sides, the neck, the bracing, the binding, all original, all 1939. He looked at Emmett. At professional appraisal through Heritage Auctions, musical instruments, division with serial number verification from the Martin Guitar Company archive in Nazareth, this guitar would be valued between $250,000 and $320,000. Conservative estimate accounting for the replaced tuning machines in the wear, $287,000. Nobody in the shop spoke. A truck downshifted on South 3rd Street outside, and the window rattled in its frame. The woman browsing the jewelry case 3 feet away looked up. Tucker cleared his throat. It took him 3 tries to get sound out. I was going to say 50. I meant 50. Emmett didn't look at him. He was looking at the guitar on the chamois, the Adirondack spruce top glowing under the fluorescent lights, and he was thinking about Grover Washington on the front porch of the house on Jefferson Street at 6:30 on a summer evening in 1967, the iced tea sweating on the railing, the screen door propped open with a brick, the lightning bugs coming up over the tobacco field across the road, hundreds of them, thousands of them, little pulses of green light in the dusk. And the G chord, that G chord ringing out into the Kentucky evening like a bell in a church that had no walls. This guitar sounds like a church, Grover had said to Old Man Shacklet in 1953. And it did. It still did. It had sounded like a church for 91 years, and nobody, not Grover, not Emmett, not Old Man Shacklet, not any of the people who had walked past the porch on Jefferson Street in the bummers of 1965 and 1978 and 1991 and heard Grover playing Hank Williams and Merle Travis in the evenings had ever known that the church was worth $287,000. Grover hadn't needed to know. Grover had needed a guitar that sounded good. He had found one for $35. Jack Renfro handed Emmett a business card white with black lettering embossed. Mr. Washington, take your time. Talk to your son. But please, sir, please do not leave this guitar in the shop. And please do not put it back in a canvas gig bag. He went out to his truck, a white Ford F-250 parked at the curb. He came back 30 seconds later with a black hard-shell guitar case, a proper one, a TKL case with brass latches and plush red lining. He opened it on the counter. He lifted the D45 with both gloved hands and laid it inside the case, cradling the neck, settling the body into the formed interior. He closed the lid. He fastened the latches. Click, click, click. He handed the case to Emmett. Emmett took the handle in both hands. The case was heavier than the gig bag, heavier than he expected. He stood there with the case at his side, the weight of it pulling on his shoulder. He nodded once at Jack Renfro. He walked out past Tucker without a word, past the woman at the jewelry case, past the rack of rifles, and the wall of electric guitars out into the January cold. In the parking lot, sitting in Kenny Phelps' truck with the engine off and the guitar case on the bench seat beside him, Emmett Marcus Washington held both hands on the steering wheel and cried for the first time since June's funeral, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep, the kind that empties you out and fills you back up at the same time, the kind that happens when you realize that the thing you thought you had lost, you never lost at all. He cried for June. He cried for his father. He cried for the 40 years of music on the porch that he had taken for granted. He cried for the timing chain and the $930 and the walk to the Kroger carrying groceries. He cried for all of it, and when he was done, he started the truck and drove home. Emmett called Grover Jr. that night at 7 in the evening. His son answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad, how you doing?" Grover Jr. had called every Sunday evening for 22 years, the same time 6:30 after dinner. And Emmett calling on a Wednesday was unusual enough that Grover's voice shifted, the easy hello replaced with something tighter. "What's wrong? Nothing's wrong," Emmett said. "But I need you to come down here. When tomorrow, if you can, I found something." What kind of something? Emmett looked at the guitar case, standing upright against the wall by the hallway, the TKL case with the brass latches. The kind of something you need to see. Grover Jr. drove down from Louisville at 5 in the morning Thursday, 4 hours straight, and pulled into the driveway of the house on Jefferson Street just after 9. Emmett had coffee waiting. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Emmett had done his homework in 1958 and 1961, the same table where Grover Sr. had changed guitar strings every Christmas morning, the same table where June had sat with her medical bills in 2023, sorting them into piles, trying to make the numbers work. The guitar case stood against the wall. Grover Jr. looked at it. Grandpa's guitar. "Yeah, why is it in a case? It was always in that gig bag," Emmett told him. He told him about the truck, the timing chain, the $930. He told him about walking into A1 Pawn with the guitar and Tucker offering $15. He told him about Jack Renfro walking through the door and stopping in his tracks and asking to examine the guitar. He told him about the serial number and the 91 guitars and the $287,000. Grover Jr. sat there with his coffee mug halfway to his mouth and didn't move for what felt like a full minute. He set the mug down. He looked at his father. He looked at the guitar case. Dad, are you? Is this real? Emmett slid Jack Renfro's business card across the table. Grover Jr. picked it up, read it, turned it over, read the back. He set it down. He looked at the case again. Can I see it? They stood up. Emmett carried the case to the table. He laid it flat. He opened the latches. He lifted the lid. The D45 lay inside the red plush lining the Adirondack spruce top, catching the kitchen light. The abalone pearl binding, throwing tiny points of reflected light across the ceiling. Grover Jr. stood there looking at it. He reached out one hand and then stopped his fingers an inch from the binding. Can I touch it? Emmett nodded. Grover Jr. ran one finger along the abalone pearl inlay, slow the way you touch something in a museum that you're not sure you're allowed to touch. He looked at the belt buckle dent. He looked at the checking in the finish. He looked at the pick scratches below the sound hole. Grandpa played this, he said. It wasn't a question. Every single night, Emmett said. Every single night. The memory came back sharp. Grover Jr., age 10, summer of 1979, sitting at the same kitchen table with a glass of lemonade and a comic book Superman, the one where Superman loses his powers. The screen door propped open. The sound of the guitar coming through from the porch, his grandfather's voice not singing, just humming along with the melody, the hum deeper than the guitar, a bass line underneath. The lightning bugs, the smell of cut grass, the heat, the way the whole evening felt like it was wrapped in that sound-safe permanent, like nothing bad could ever happen as long as the guitar was playing. I used to fall asleep to that sound, Grover Jr. said, when we'd visit, when I was little. I'd be in the back bedroom and I could hear it through the window. I thought that was just what evenings sounded like. Emmett closed his eyes. When you were 6, he said, you asked me why I didn't play guitar, like Grandpa. You remember that? Grover Jr. shook his head. You said, Daddy, why don't you play? And I told you, some men make music and some men listen to it. Your grandpa makes it. I listen. You said, but you could learn. And I said, I don't need to learn, son. I just need to hear it. They sat back down. Emmett poured more coffee. Grover Jr. stared at the guitar. What are you going to do? I don't know, Emmett said. Jack Renfro said to call him, said Heritage Auctions would want it, said it should be authenticated and appraised and probably sold, said it's worth more than this house. Grover Jr. was quiet for a long time. Then he said, do you want to sell it? Emmett looked at the getter. The question sat between them. No, Grover Jr. said, I mean, do you want to? Because, Dad, this is Grandpa's. This is him. This is the sound I heard every night when I was a kid. This is what he did every evening for 40 years. If we sell it, it goes to Dallas or New York or wherever, and we never see it again. We could keep it. We could just keep it. Emmett thought about that. He thought about the guitar, staying in the house, standing in the corner, unplayed, the strings dead, the neck bowed. He thought about Grover sitting on the porch with the guitar in his lap, tuning it, playing it, the sound carrying across the yard. He thought about what Grover would say if he were sitting here right now. Your grandpa, Emmett said, didn't keep that guitar because it was worth money. He kept it because it sounded good. He played it because it made a sound he wanted to hear. If he'd known it was worth $287,000, you think he would have played it different? Grover Jr. smiled just a little. No, he would have played it the same. Exactly, Emmett said. He didn't care what it was worth. He cared what it sounded like. And right now, son, it doesn't sound like anything. It's been sitting in a closet for 29 years. Your grandpa wouldn't want that. He'd want it played. And if it can't be played, if it's too valuable to be played, then it should go somewhere people can see it and know what it was and know that a man named Grover Washington played it on his porch every evening for 40 years and didn't need to know that he was holding a fortune in his lap. Grover Jr. nodded slowly. And the money, the money. Emmett said we use the way Grandpa would have used it. We fix what needs fixing. We help who needs helping. We don't waste it and we don't hoard it. We do right by it. Grover Jr. reached across the table and put his hand on his father's hand. Okay, he said. Okay. They called Jack Renfro at 9:30. He answered on the first ring. Mr. Washington, Mr. Renfro, I've talked to my son. We'd like to move forward. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Jack Renfro's voice careful, controlled. Mr. Washington, I'm very glad to hear that. I'm going to connect you with the director of the Musical Instruments Division at Heritage Auctions. Her name is Dr. Susan Falk. She'll walk you through the authentication process. It'll take about 2 weeks. They'll need to verify the serial number with the Martin Archive. They'll need to examine the guitar in person. But based on what I saw, Mr. Washington, I have no doubt this is the real thing. Thank you, Emmett said. Mr. Renfro, before you go. Yes, sir. Why'd you stop at the pawn shop? You said you were buying a banjo collection. Why'd you stop at a pawn shop on the way? Jack Renfro laughed quiet. Mr. Washington, I've been buying and selling vintage guitars for 40 years. You stop at every pawn shop. You stop at every estate sale. You stop at every garage sale because 99 times out of 100, there's nothing. But that one time, there's a 1939 Martin D45 leaning against a counter in a shop in Paducah, Kentucky. And if you don't stop, you miss it. I've found instruments in storage units in barn lofts in basements flooded with 3 feet of water. I found a 1936 Gibson EOL5 in a trash pile behind a house that was being demolished. The owner had died and his kids were throwing everything away. I pulled up, saw the case, asked if I could look inside. Guitar was worth $45,000. You stop. You always stop. Emmett smiled. I'm glad you stopped. So am I. Mr. Washington, so am I. The Martin Guitar Company Archive in Nazareth, Pennsylvania confirmed serial number 75269 as a D45 Dreadnought acoustic guitar shipped to Amro Music Company, a dealer in Memphis, Tennessee, on November 14, 1939. The shipping ledger preserved in the Martin archive showed the guitar listed as one of 6 instruments in that shipment, the only D45. The original retail price, $200, was noted in the margin in pencil. The ledger also noted the specifications: Adirondack spruce top, Brazilian rosewood back and sides, ebony fingerboard, abalone pearl inlay. Built by master luthier August Larson, one of Martin's senior craftsmen who had been with the company since 1919. The records from Amro Music, preserved at the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum in Nashville, showed the guitar sold new in December 1939 for $200 to a buyer whose name was illegible in the carbon copy receipt, just a smudged initial that might have been a J or a T or an I. The receipt noted payment in cash. The guitar had resurfaced at Shacklett's Music in Paducah in 1951, consigned by an estate origin unknown, priced at $40. Old man Shacklett, whose grandson Tom would later write a letter to Emmett, had dropped the price to $35 after 2 years on the wall, and Grover Washington had walked in on a Saturday afternoon in April of 1953 and played a G chord and walked out with it. Dr. Susan Falk flew to Paducah from Dallas on a Tuesday in late January. She was 54 short, maybe 5'2", with steel gray hair cut in a sharp bob and black frame glasses. She wore a charcoal wool blazer, dark jeans, and low-heel black boots. She carried a large aluminum case, the kind photographers use, and a leather portfolio. Emmett and Grover Jr. met her at the house on Jefferson Street. She set the aluminum case on the kitchen table and opened it. Inside were tools, white cotton gloves, a jeweler's loop, a portable ultraviolet light, a precision caliper, a small digital microscope, a humidistat, a notebook. She pulled on the gloves and asked Emmett to open the guitar case. He did. She stood there looking at the D45 for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Washington, before I begin, I want you to understand what I'm looking at. This is not just a guitar. This is one of 91 instruments that represent the pinnacle of American lutherie. It is a piece of history. It is a work of art, and it has been played, truly played for 40 years, which makes it even more valuable because a played guitar is a living thing and an unplayed guitar is a museum piece. Your father gave this guitar a life. That matters." She lifted the guitar from the case with both hands. She laid it on a soft black cloth on the table. She examined the top, the back, the sides of the neck. She measured the width of the neck at the nut with the caliper. 1 and 11/16 inches. Factory specification for a 1939 D45. She measured the depth of the body. 4 3/4 inches. Correct. She measured the scale length nut to bridge. 25.4 inches. Correct. She used the portable UV light to examine the finish, looking for repairs or refinishing. There were none. The finish was original, age-checked, but untouched. She used the digital microscope to examine the abalone inlay, the binding, the purfling. She photographed the serial number inside the sound hole. She photographed the headstock stamp. She photographed the belt buckle dent. She photographed the replaced tuning machines. She opened the leather portfolio and pulled out a file of documents. Photocopies of the Martin shipping ledger from 1939, photocopies of the Amro music sales records from December 1939, a letter from the Martin Guitar Company archivist Dick Boak confirming the authenticity of serial number 75269, a letter from August Larson's grandson confirming that his grandfather had built this guitar, a photograph of the Martin factory floor in 1939 showing men in aprons working on D45 bodies. She laid them on the table in a row. "Mr. Washington, this guitar is absolutely authentic. It is a 1939 Martin D45 serial number 75269 number 73 of 91 pre-war D45s produced between 1933 and 1942. The body is entirely original. The top backsides, neck fingerboard bridge, bracing binding, and inlay are all original to 1939. The tuning machines are Grover Rotomatics aftermarket installed sometime in the 1960s based on the wear pattern. That reduces the value by approximately 10%. The finish has extensive checking, which is normal and expected for a guitar of this age that has been played regularly. The checking does not affect the structural integrity, and in the vintage market is actually considered desirable as proof of age and authenticity." She paused. "Based on recent comparable sales, most notably the 1940 D45 that sold at our Dallas auction in 2019 for $312,000, and accounting for the replaced tuning machines, I would estimate the current market value of this instrument at $285,000 to $295,000. If we were to include it in our next musical instruments auction in April, I would expect it to sell within that range, possibly higher if there is competitive bidding. However, Mr. Washington, I want to offer you another option. Heritage Auctions maintains a permanent collection of historically significant instruments. We display them in our Dallas gallery in climate-controlled cases with full documentation. We acquire these instruments through long-term loans from the families who own them. The family retains ownership. We retain the right to display and preserve the instrument. In exchange, we pay a one-time acquisition fee that is typically 90 to 95% of the estimated auction value. The instrument remains in the family in perpetuity, but is preserved and displayed professionally. For a guitar like this, with this history, I would offer a 99-year family loan with an acquisition fee of $279,000. The guitar would be displayed with a placard that tells the story of your father, Grover Washington, in the 40 years he played it on his porch in Paducah. It would be available for researchers and musicians to study. It would be preserved for future generations, and your family would retain ownership. If in 99 years your descendants want the guitar back, they can have it. If they want to extend the loan, they can. The choice remains with the family. Emmett and Grover Jr. looked at each other. Grover Jr. nodded. Emmett turned to Dr. Falk. We'll take the loan. The check arrived by courier on February 3rd, 2024. $279,000 drawn on the Heritage Auctions accounts payable to Emmett Marcus Washington. Emmett took it to First Community Bank on Broadway and deposited it. The teller, a young woman named Jessica, looked at the amount and called the branch manager. The branch manager, a man named Harold Pemberton, who had known Emmett for 30 years, came out of his office, looked at the check, looked at Emmett and said, "Emmett, is this real?" "It's real," Emmett said. "It's from my daddy's guitar." Harold looked at the check again. "Emmett, this is Harold stopped. This is wonderful. Your father would be so proud." "I hope so," Emmett said. "I really hope so." The story ran in the Paducah Sun on February 10th, page 3 local news. Paducah man discovers father's guitar, worth $279,000. There was a photograph of Emmett standing in front of the house on Jefferson Street, holding a framed photograph of Grover Sr. sitting on the porch with the guitar. The article told the story, the pawn shop, the $15 offer, Jack Renfro, the authentication, the sale. It quoted Emmett, "My father played that guitar every evening for 40 years and never knew what it was worth. He didn't need to know. He just needed it to sound good." The article was written by a reporter named Angela Morris, no relation to Reverend Morris, and she had spent an hour sitting at Emmett's kitchen table listening to him talk about his father, about the porch, about the sound. The call started that afternoon. Friends, neighbors, people Emmett hadn't talked to in 20 years. Everybody wanted to know about the guitar. Everybody wanted to know what he was going to do with the money. Emmett was polite. He thanked them for calling. He didn't tell them what he was going to do with the money because he was still figuring it out himself, sitting at the kitchen table with Grover Jr. and a yellow legal pad writing down numbers. Truck timing chain, $930. Property taxes 3 years forward, $4,200. Grover Jr. for the boys' college, $50,000. Trust fund for Marcus and Tasha, $100,000, total $50,000 each. New truck 2024 Ford Ranger, $38,000. June's headstone, new one, $8,500. That left $77,370. Emmett looked at the number. He thought about what to do with it. He thought about Grover. He thought about the porch. He thought about the sound. On February 15th, Emmett drove to the Monument Company on Park Avenue and ordered a new headstone for June. The old one was small, flat granite, just her name, and the dates 1946 to 2023. The new one was upright, rose granite, polished with her full name, June Marie Bolin Washington, and the dates, and below that, a line Emmett had written himself. Wife, mother, she heard the music. The owner of the Monument Company, a man named Ed Stallings, read the line and nodded. "That's nice, Emmett. That's real nice. When do you want it installed?" Emmett thought about it. "Can you have it ready by her birthday?" "When's her birthday?" "March 17th. "We can do that," Ed said. "We'll have it ready." On February 20th, Emmett drove to Paducah Ford and bought a 2024 Ford Ranger Green Crew Cab, the first new vehicle he had ever owned in his life. The salesman, a young guy named Todd, kept saying, "You sure, Mr. Washington? You don't want to test drive it. You don't want to look at the options," Emmett said. "It's green. It runs. I'll take it." He paid cash. He drove it off the lot at 3 in the afternoon. He drove it home and parked it in the driveway and sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes with the engine off, smelling the new plastic and new carpet smell, running his hands over the steering wheel. June would have liked this truck. She would have said, "Emmett, it's beautiful." She would have wanted to go for a drive right then just to see how it rode. He sat there thinking about that, thinking about all the drives they would never take, and then he got out and went inside. On March 1st, Emmett sent Grover Jr. a check for $50,000 with a note. For Marcus and Tasha, college, books, whatever they need. Don't argue. Love, Dad. Grover Jr. called that night. Dad, this is too much. It's not enough, Emmett said. It's what your grandpa would have done. Your grandpa worked every day of his life so you could have a better life than he had. That's what fathers do. That's what grandfathers do. This money came from his guitar. It should go to his great-grandchildren. Grover Jr. was quiet on the other end. Then he said, "Thank you, Dad. Thank you. You're welcome, son." On March 10th, Emmett and Grover Jr. met with a lawyer in Paducah, a man named Richard Gaines, and set up a trust fund for Marcus and Tasha, $50,000 each, to be distributed when they turned 25, or graduated college, whichever came first. The lawyer drew up the papers. Emmett and Grover Jr. signed. The money was transferred. The lawyer shook their hands. "Your father would be proud," he said to Emmett. "I hope so," Emmett said. On March 17th, June's birthday, the new headstone was installed at Oak Grove Cemetery. Emmett drove out in the new Green Ranger and stood there looking at it. Rose granite polished her name, her dates in the line. Wife, mother. She heard the music. The sun was out, the grass was green, spring was coming. Emmett stood there for a long time. He talked to her the way he had talked to her every week since she died, telling her about the guitar, about the money, about the truck, about the kids. He told her he missed her. He told her he loved her. He told her he was doing okay. And then he got in the truck and drove home. The guitar went on permanent display at the Heritage Auctions Gallery in Dallas in April. The case was climate-controlled glass on all sides, mounted on a pedestal at eye level. The lighting was soft LED, angled to bring out the grain of the spruce and the rosewood without damaging the finish. There was a small speaker system mounted in the ceiling above the case that played a recording of a D45 of the same vintage, not Grover's guitar, but one of its sisters, so visitors could hear what the guitar sounded like, what Grover had heard every evening for 40 years. The placard beside the case read, C.F. Martin and Company D45 acoustic guitar, 1939, serial number 75269. Number 73 of 91 pre-war D45s produced 1933 to 1942. Original retail price $200. Purchase used for $35 at Shacklett's Music, Paducah, Kentucky in 1953 by Grover Washington Sr., 1916 to 1995, tobacco farmer and school bus driver. Played on the front porch of the Washington family home on Jefferson Street, Paducah, every evening for 40 years. On loan from the family of Emmett M. Washington, Paducah, Kentucky. Grover Jr. drove Emmett to Dallas for the dedication on April 14th. They flew actually the first time Emmett had been on an airplane since 1966, coming home from Germany. They stayed at a hotel near the gallery. They ate dinner at a steakhouse. They went to the gallery the next morning. The guitar was there in the case under the lights. Emmett stood in front of it. He looked at the Adirondack spruce, the abalone binding the belt buckle dent. He listened to the recording playing from the speaker, the sound of a D45 deep and resonant and clear, and for a moment he was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with his arithmetic homework. The screen door propped open with a brick, the evening coming on, and the sound of his father's guitar coming through the screen, the G chord, the finger picking, the melody of I Saw the Light. "You had the best guitar in the world," Daddy Emmett said, quiet enough that only Grover Jr. standing beside him could hear. "And you just played it." Grover Jr. put his hand on his father's shoulder. They stood there together, looking at the guitar, and neither of them spoke for a long time. A letter came in the mail on April 22nd, postmarked Paducah. The return address said Tom Shacklett. Emmett opened it at the kitchen table. The letter was handwritten, 2 pages blue ink. Dear Mr. Washington, my name is Tom Shacklett. I am 71 years old and I live here in Paducah. I am the grandson of Ernest Shacklett, who owned Shacklett's Music on Broadway from 1938 to 1979. I read the story in the Paducah Sun about your father's guitar, and I wanted to write to you. My grandfather told me a story once many years ago about the most beautiful guitar that ever hung on the wall of his shop. He said it was a big Martin with pearl trim and a sound like a church bell. He said it had come in on consignment from an estate in 1951, and he had priced it at $40 because that's what he thought it was worth. But nobody bought it. People would come in, pick it up, play it, and say it was too big, too loud, too expensive. After 2 years, he dropped the price to $35. And one day, a black man walked in, and a tobacco farmer, my grandfather, said quiet, polite. He picked up the guitar and played one chord, a G chord, and my grandfather said the sound filled the whole shop. The man looked at my grandfather and said, "Mr. Shacklet, this guitar sounds like a church." And my grandfather said, "Son, for $35, it's yours." My grandfather told me, "That man heard what I heard. That guitar was waiting for him. I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to know that my grandfather always remembered your father and always remembered that sale, not because of the money, but because of the sound and because your father heard it the same way my grandfather heard it." My grandfather died in 1984, but before he died, he told me that story at least a dozen times, and every time he smiled. He said, "I've sold thousands of guitars, Tom, but that one was special because the man who bought it understood what it was." I hope this letter finds you well. I hope you and your family are doing okay. And I hope you know that your father's music meant something to a lot of people, more people than he probably ever knew. Sincerely, Tom Shacklet. Emmett read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it and put it in an envelope and drove to Frame Gallery on Broadway and had it frame the letter under glass in a simple black frame. He hung it on the wall in the living room beside the front window, beside the spot where Grover's chair used to sit on the porch, the spot where Grover had sat every evening for 40 years, with a guitar in his lap, and played for the tobacco field and the lightning bugs in the evening. The next Sunday morning, Emmett woke at 6 in the morning the way he had woken every Sunday for 40 years. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and read the Paducah Sun. At 8:30, he got dressed, dark slacks, white shirt, the navy blue blazer June had bought him at Dillard's in 2018, and drove the new Green Ranger to First Baptist Church on Jefferson Street. He parked in the same spot he had parked for 34 years, third row under the oak tree. He walked inside. He sat in the same pew, fourth row on the right, the pew where June used to sit beside him, with her hymnal open even though she knew all the words. Reverend Calvin Morris, 68, who had been the pastor at First Baptist for 22 years, saw Emmett come in and nodded from the pulpit. After the service, after the benediction, after the congregation had filed out, shaking hands and talking about the weather and the upcoming church picnic, Reverend Morris walked over to where Emmett stood by the door. "Emmett," he said, "I read about your father's guitar. That's a remarkable story." "It is," Emmett said. "How are you doing?" "I'm good, Reverend. I'm doing good." Reverend Morris put a hand on Emmett's shoulder. "Your father was a good man. I remember him sitting on that porch. I used to walk past your house on my way home from the church back when I was a young assistant pastor in the 90s. I'd hear him playing. I'd stop and listen. He never knew I was there, just standing on the sidewalk listening. It was the best part of my walk home. Sometimes I'd stand there for 3 or 4 songs just listening, and then I'd walk on." Your father had a gift, Emmett, not just for playing, for making a space where people could listen. "That's a rare thing," Emmett smiled. "He would have liked knowing that." "I think he would have," Reverend Morris said. After church, Emmett drove to Kirchhoff's Bakery on Market House Square, the old German bakery that had been there since 1873. The place that made the best donuts in Paducah raised yeast donuts with a thin sugar glaze that cracked when you bit into them. He walked inside, the smell of bread and sugar and coffee. He walked to the booth in the back corner, the same booth where he'd sat every Sunday for 22 years. 2 men were already there waiting. Leroy Pace, 77, retired electrician, tall, bald, with hands the size of dinner plates, and a laugh that sounded like a diesel engine turning over. And Clarence Whitlow, 79, retired postal worker, thin with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and a habit of tilting his head when he listened, like he was trying to hear something nobody else could hear. They had been Emmett's friends since 1968. They had been pallbearers at June's funeral. They had brought casseroles to the house for 3 weeks after she died. They had sat with him in the evenings when he couldn't stand to be alone. They had not asked questions. They had just been there. Leroy looked up as Emmett slid into the booth. Heard you made the son, Emmett. Heard that, Emmett said. He poured coffee from the pot on the table. Martin guitar, huh? Clarence said. Yeah. Leroy shook his head. $279,000. $279,000. That's what they tell me, Emmett said. And that kid at the pawn shop said what 15 bucks, Clarence said. 15 bucks, Emmett confirmed. The three of them laughed the quiet, chest-deep laugh of old men who have lived long enough to know that the world rarely sees what matters, and that sometimes if you wait long enough, it finally does. You gonna be okay? Emmett Leroy asked. The money, I mean. You gonna be smart with it? I hope so, Emmett said. I paid the truck, paid the tax, helped Grover Jr. with the boys, set up a trust, bought a new headstone for June. Leroy and Clarence nodded. That's good, Clarence said. That's right. That's what you should do. What are you going to do with the rest? Leroy asked. Emmett thought about that. He'd been thinking about it for days. The $77,370 that was left after the truck and the taxes and the trust and the headstone and Grover Jr.'s check. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table every night looking at the number, trying to figure out what Grover would have done. I don't know yet, Emmett said, but I'll figure it out. On May 1st, Emmett drove to Sutherland's Auto Service on Broadway and paid Dale for the timing chain. Dale took the check, looked at it, looked at Emmett. Heard about your guitar. Mr. Washington, that's something. It is, Emmett said. Dale handed him the keys to the Ranger. But Emmett said, that's the old truck. I bought a new one. Dale looked confused. Then what do you want me to do with this one? Fix it. Emmett said, I want to give it to someone. On May 5th, Emmett drove the old 2000 Ford Ranger Green, 140,000 miles new timing chain to the First Baptist Church parking lot. He found Reverend Morris in his office. Reverend Emmett said, I want to donate this truck to the church, to someone who needs it. You know anybody? Reverend Morris thought for a moment. Then he said Jerome Russell. Jerome Russell was 54, a deacon at the church, a janitor at Lourdes Hospital, father of 3. His car had died in March, and he'd been taking the bus to work, 2 buses an hour and a half each way, which meant he left his house at 4:30 in the morning and got home at 7:30 in the evening. And his wife Loretta worked the night shift at a nursing home, and their kids were being raised by Jerome's mother, who was 76 and had arthritis and could barely walk, and the whole family was hanging on by a thread. Emmett knew Jerome. They'd served on the deacon board together for 12 years. Jerome was a good man, a steady man, the kind of man who never complained, never asked for help, just kept going. Emmett said, Can you give him my number? Reverend Morris nodded. I'll call him right now. Jerome called that evening. Mr. Washington, yeah. Reverend Morris said you have a truck you want to give away. I do, Emmett said. It's a 2000 Ranger. Just put a new timing chain in it. Runs good. It's yours if you want it. Jerome was quiet on the other end of the line. Then he said, Mr. Washington, I can't afford. He stopped. Emmett said, You're not buying it, Jerome. I'm giving it to you. No money, no payments. It's yours. Jerome was quiet again. Then his voice broke. Mr. Washington, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Emmett said. Just come pick it up. It's at the church. Keys are with Reverend Morris. Jerome said, Mr. Washington, this is an answer to prayer. My wife and I, we've been praying for a way to get me to work, and this is, he stopped. Thank you, Jerome said. Thank you. You're welcome, Emmett said. On May 10th, Emmett met Jerome in the church parking lot and handed him the keys. Jerome stood there with the keys in his hand and tears running down his face. Mr. Washington, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Emmett said. Just take care of it. It was my wife's truck. She loved it. Jerome nodded. I will, Mr. Washington. I promise. I'll take good care of it. And Jerome, Emmett said, Yes, sir. If you ever have trouble with it, you bring it to Sutherland's on Broadway. Ask for Dale. Tell him I sent you. He'll take care of you. Jerome nodded, wiping his eyes. Thank you, Mr. Washington. Thank you. Emmett watched Jerome drive away in the Green Ranger, and he thought about June, and he thought about how she would have liked this, how she would have said, Emmett, that was the right thing to do. And he felt for the first time since she died like maybe he was going to be okay. On June 1st, Emmett got a call from Heritage Auctions in Dallas. It was Dr. Susan Falk. Mr. Washington, I wanted to let you know that the guitar has had over 10,000 visitors since we put it on display in April. We've had calls from musicians, researchers, and collectors from all over the world. People want to know about your father. They want to know about the 40 years he played it. They want to know the story. Would you be willing to be interviewed for what? For a short documentary we're producing about the guitar. We'd like to tell the story properly. We'd like to honor your father's memory. Emmett thought about it. Yes, he said. I think my daddy would want people to know. The documentary crew came to Paducah in July. A director, a cameraman, a sound engineer. They interviewed Emmett at the house on Jefferson Street. They filmed the porch, the spot where Grover's chair used to sit. They filmed the hall closet where the Geister had leaned for 29 years. They interviewed Grover Jr. They interviewed Reverend Morris. They interviewed Tom Shacklet. They interviewed Leroy and Clarence. They interviewed people who had lived on Jefferson Street in the 60s and 70s and 80s, people who remembered Grover sitting on the porch playing guitar every evening, people who said they could hear the music from 3 blocks away in quiet summer nights. The documentary, 22 minutes long, premiered online in September. It was called The Guitar on the Porch. It told the story of Grover Washington, the tobacco farmer and school bus driver who bought a guitar for $35 in 1953 and played it every evening for 40 years, not knowing it was one of the most valuable guitars in the world. It told the story of Emmett, the son who almost sold it for $15. It told the story of Jack Renfro, the expert who walked into a pawn shop at the right moment. And it told the story of the guitar itself, number 73 of 91, serial number 75269, the D45, that sounded like a church. The documentary opened with a shot of the house on Jefferson Street, the porch empty, the chair gone, and Emmett's voice over the image. My father sat on this porch every evening for 40 years. He played the same guitar, the same songs, in the same order. And he never knew that what he was holding was worth a fortune. He just knew it sounded good. And for him, that was enough. The documentary was watched 2.3 million times in the first month. Comments came in from all over the world, from musicians who said they'd been playing guitar for 40 years and had never heard a story like this, from sons and daughters who said it reminded them of their fathers, from people who said they were going to call their parents, go through their attics, pay attention to the things that had been sitting in closets and basements for decades because you never know, from people who said they cried watching it, from people who said it made them think about what mattered in life and what didn't. On October 15th, Emmett got a call from a woman in Nashville. Her name was Dr. Angela Carter. She was the director of the National Museum of African American Music. Mr. Washington, I've seen the documentary about your father's guitar. I'd like to talk to you about creating an exhibit about what? About your father, about Black musicians in rural Kentucky, about the role of music in Black communities in the South, about the porch, Mr. Washington. The porch is a stage. The porch is a gathering place. The porch as a place where culture was made and preserved. Your father represents something important. He represents a tradition, a way of life, a sound that's disappearing. I'd like to honor that. Emmett thought about Grover sitting on the porch, the guitar in his lap, playing for nobody but the evening. Yes, he said, I think my daddy would like that. The exhibit opened in Nashville in March of the following year. It was called Porch Music, The Sound of Home. It featured photographs of Grover interviews with Emmett and Grover Jr., a recording of a 1939 D45, and a section about the history of Black musicians in Kentucky, from Bill Monroe's influence on bluegrass to the overlooked contributions of black string band musicians in Appalachia. The exhibit included a wall of photographs, images of porches all across the South, black families sitting on porches, guitars in hand, children at their feet, neighbors listening from the yard. It included recordings, old-field recordings from the 1930s and 40s, voices and guitars captured on tape before they were lost. It included instruments, guitars and banjos, and fiddles loaned by families who had kept them for generations. And at the center of the exhibit was a large photograph of Grover sitting on the porch, the D-45 in his lap, taken by Opal in 1974. Emmett and Grover Jr. drove to Nashville for the opening. They walked through the exhibit. They stood in front of the photograph of Grover. The placard beside it read, Grover Washington Sr., 1916 to 1995. Paducah, Kentucky. Tobacco farmer, school bus driver, husband, father. Every evening for 40 years, he played this guitar on his porch. He played for the sound, not for the audience, not for the applause, for the sound. This is the sound of home. Emmett stood there looking at the photograph, at his father's hands on the fretboard, at the concentration on his father's face, but at the guitar, the D-45, the $287,000 guitar that Grover had bought for $35 and played like it was worth $35 because to Grover it was. To Grover it was worth the sound it made, and the sound it made was worth everything. On the drive back to Paducah, Grover Jr. said, Dad, are you glad? About the guitar, about everything that's happened. Emmett thought about that. He thought about June in the hospital, the way she'd asked him to play her something. He thought about the truck, the timing chain, the $930 he hadn't had. He thought about walking into the pawn shop with the guitar, the kid offering $15, Jack Renfro walking through the door. He thought about the $279,000, the new truck, the headstone, the trust fund, Jerome Russell crying in the church parking lot with the keys in his hand. He thought about the documentary, the exhibit, the 2.3 million people who had watched the story and heard his father's name and seen his father's face. Yes, Emmett said. I'm glad. I think Daddy would be glad too. In November, Emmett got a letter from a woman in Chicago. Her name was Margaret Lawson. She was 81 years old. She wrote, Dear Mr. Washington, I saw the documentary about your father and his guitar. I wanted to tell you that when I was a little girl, I lived in Paducah. I lived on Monroe Street, 2 blocks from your father's house on Jefferson. Every evening in the summer, my mother would walk me to the corner store for ice cream, and we would walk past your father's house. He would be sitting on the porch playing his guitar. My mother would stop, and we would stand on the sidewalk and listen. Sometimes for 1 song, sometimes for 3. Your father never knew we were there. We never spoke to him. We just listened. And then we would walk home. That sound, Mr. Washington, that guitar is the sound of my childhood. It is the sound of summer evenings and ice cream and my mother holding my hand. My mother died in 2015, but every time I think of her, I hear that guitar. I wanted you to know that your father's music touched more lives than he ever knew. Thank you for sharing his story. Sincerely, Margaret Lawson. Emmett read the letter 3 times. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter in his hand and cried. Not sad crying, but the kind of crying that comes when you realize that something you thought was small was actually big. That something you thought was private was actually public. That something you thought was yours was actually everybody's. He folded the letter and put it in the frame with Tom Shacklett's letter. 2 letters side by side under glass hanging on the wall beside the front window. The next Sunday morning, Emmett drove to Kirchhoff's Bakery and slid into the booth where Leroy and Clarence were waiting. Leroy poured him coffee. Clarence pushed the plate of donuts across the table. They sat there in the quiet 3 old men who had known each other for 56 years, who had buried wives and raised children and worked jobs and paid bills and done the best they could with what they had. Leroy looked at Emmett. You doing okay, Emmett? Yeah, I am, Emmett said. I really am. Clarence tilted his head the way he did when he was listening for something. What are you going to do with the rest of the money? The rest of it, yeah. The part you haven't spent. Emmett smiled. I've been thinking about that, and I think I'm going to give some of it to the church. For the music program, buy some instruments for the kids. Guitars, maybe. So they can learn, Leroy nodded. That's good. Clarence said, your daddy would like that. I think so too, Emmett said. On December 15th, Emmett met with Reverend Morris in his office at First Baptist. He wrote a check for $25,000. For the music program, Emmett said, buy guitars, buy lessons, whatever the kids need. I want them to learn. I want them to know what music sounds like when it's made right, when it's made for the sound, not for the money. Reverend Morris took the check. He looked at it. He looked at Emmett. Emmett, this is Reverend Morris stopped. His eyes filled. This is going to change lives. That's the idea, Emmett said. On Christmas morning, Emmett woke at 6 in the morning. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and thought about Grover sitting at this same table on Christmas mornings from 1971 to 1994, changing the strings on the guitar one string at a time, tuning each one 3 times before moving to the next. The ritual Grover had performed every year in honor of the gift Opal had given him in 1971. Emmett thought about his father's hands, the careful way he worked the patience. At 10 in the morning, Grover Jr. called, Merry Christmas, Dad. Merry Christmas, son. The boys want to talk to you. Marcus got on the line first. Hey, Grandpa. Merry Christmas. How's school, Marcus? Good. Real good. I'm thinking about changing my major. To what music business? I want to work with musicians. Help them the way that guy, Jack Renfro, helped you. Find the hidden value. Help people understand what they have. Emmett smiled. I think that's a fine idea, Marcus. I think that's a real fine idea. Then Tasha got on. Hi, Grandpa. Merry Christmas, sweetheart. I'm writing a paper about great-great-grandpa Grover for my history class, about how he played guitar and didn't know it was valuable. My teacher said it's a metaphor. Emmett laughed. A metaphor for what? For how we don't always know what we have until we lose it, or until somebody shows us. Do you think that's right, Grandpa? Emmett thought about that. He thought about Grover on the porch, the guitar in his lap, playing I Saw the Light and softly and tenderly for nobody but the evening. He thought about the sound carrying across the yard, across the road down the block, into the ears of Margaret Lawson and Reverend Morris and all the people who had stopped to listen and never said a word. He thought about the $287,000 guitar that Grover had bought for $35 and played like it was priceless because to Grover it was. I think your great-great-grandpa knew what he had, Emmett said. He had a guitar that sounded good, and that was enough. On New Year's Eve, Emmett sat on the porch of the house on Jefferson Street in the same spot where Grover's chair used to sit and watch the sun go down over the tobacco field across the road. The field was fallow now, had been for years grown over with thistle and wild grass. But the view was the same. The sky was the same. The evening was the same. At 6:30, Emmett heard it. Not the guitar, his father's voice. Not out loud, in his head. The way you hear a song you've heard 1,000 times, the melody so deep in your memory that it plays without you asking for it. I saw the light, the finger-picking pattern, the bass line, the melody. Emmett closed his eyes and listened. And for a moment, for just a moment, he was 8 years old again, sitting at the kitchen table with his homework, the screen door propped open, the lightning bugs coming up over the field, and his father's guitar ringing out into the Kentucky evening, like a bell in a church with no walls. He opened his eyes. The sun was almost down. The sky was orange and pink and deep blue. He stood up. He went inside. He closed the door. The next Sunday morning, Emmett sat in the booth at Kirchhoff's with Leroy and Clarence. They drank coffee. They ate donuts. They talked about the weather, about the church picnic coming up in the spring, about Leroy's grandson who was getting married in April, about Clarence's hip that was acting up again. And then Leroy said, "You ever miss it, Emmett? Miss what? The guitar. Having it. Knowing it's yours." Emmett thought about that. He thought about the guitar in the climate-controlled case in Dallas, Under the lights, the placard beside it telling the story of Grover Washington, the porch, the 40 years. He thought about the 10,000 visitors who had seen it, the 2.3 million people who had watched the documentary, the exhibit in Nashville, the letters from Tom Shacklet and Margaret Lawson. He thought about Marcus wanting to study music business, about Tasha writing her paper, about Jerome driving to work in the Green Ranger every morning, about the kids at First Baptist learning to play guitar with instruments bought with his father's money. No, Emmett said, I don't miss it. It's not mine to miss. It was never mine. It was Daddy's, and now it's everybody's. And that's how it should be. Clarence tilted his head. That's a good way to think about it. Leroy nodded. Your daddy would be proud. Emmett smiled. I hope so. A kid in a pawn shop looked at that guitar and said $15. He didn't know. They never do, because some things have hidden worth, not just in money, but in memory, in sound. In the 40 years, a man sat on a porch and played for nobody but the evening. Grover Washington didn't need to know his guitar was worth $287,000. He needed a guitar that sounded like a church. He found one for $35. And that was enough. That was always enough.